Recording is now in progress. I've just been told in my hearing aids here. So welcome to all of you on the Zoom as well. We've got a great story to read here with a big question in the middle of it. And I hope the video was okay. It was one of those things where I did my normal Monday routine. And then I ran back in here Tuesday afternoon and did the next week because I had to leave town. And I uploaded it on YouTube and I sent the link to Sue Ann so that she could send it out. And I went back to it like an hour later and 3 people had already started watching it. And I thought, that's actually great. So thank you for that. Let's start with prayer and then we'll jump right into the text. Gracious God, it's hard for us to imagine sometimes that people of old had our doubts and our hopes and our frustration, our questions. And yet, the more we listen to how you were present among them, the more we marvel at how you are present among us in our doubts and our hopes and our questions. So open us up to experience the depth of this story, and more importantly, the way of your grace. Amen. Hi, Beryl.
No.
I'm going to put a couple of. Can you communicate that to Beryl? Does anybody else need a handout? All right, we're reading verses 21 through 25. It's on the back of your handout. We'll start by reading that, and then we'll begin with any questions that you have regarding the text or the video. Those of you on the Zoom, again, let me say that in a moment you'll be able to communicate to us, but just give us a second. Here's our text. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondered at his delay in the sanctuary. When he did come out, he could not speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the sanctuary. He kept motioning to them and remained unable to speak. When his time of service was ended, he went to his home. After those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she remained in seclusion. She said, "This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people." This ends the reading. Thanks. Okay, any questions you have regarding the text or the video, anything that was patently unclear, striking? Yes, Glenn.
Little geography.
Yes.
Did you say at one time that Zechariah's coterie, whatever it was located in Bethel?
I did not. Okay, all we know is that it was, what's the phrase, like in the country or something like that. I don't think a specific city was given to it.
Well, my impression was that when he went home, he left Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah, I think it was just described as the hill country. And it might have said he left Jerusalem or left Judea to the hill country. I don't recall exactly. Yeah. Look back earlier in the chapter when they're introduced, I think it says something about that. But I don't think a specific city is given. Anybody else? Yes, Phil.
The interesting phrase "after those days," and like, okay.
Yeah.
After what? After those days of anyway, I just wondered what those are. And then her little speech that somehow the tenses don't work very well. I mean, that's probably translation. The has done.
The fact that she's saying it in past tense, in fact, right then.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, why is she using the past tense?
It just feels awkward.
Yeah, it does feel that way. If she's rejoicing, she should be rejoicing in the moment, not in, look what God did, right? Yeah. And maybe it's the conception itself that, I don't know. And if she went 5 months in seclusion, we don't know where in those 5 months she's talking, right? Like, just her song. Yes, Loretta.
Okay, this is bizarre,
Okay.
but because of her age, maybe she thought she was going through the change instead of being pregnant. And maybe that's why she stayed secluded for 5 months
Oh, yeah.
until she felt the baby kick.
Okay. All right. That's a great comment. And you know what? I want to take it and hold it off until we get down to that question itself, because I think that's got a lot of promise for us, and I want to chew on that with you. So help me not forget it. I want to go back to that. Yeah. Yes, Jerry.
Well, I think,
Oh, by the way, Loretta just offered a theory of why Elizabeth went into hiding. And we're going to bring it back later when we get to that specific question. And it's a good one. Yes, Jerry.
I have another theory of that, which relates also to Zechariah. If he went out and told them that some angel came and he's going to have a baby, they'd think he's nuts and he'd lose his job. So he had to be quiet. And he couldn't say why the angel came, so he had to be quiet. So he just muted himself. He goes home and he tells his wife. She becomes pregnant at some point.
Okay.
But at a month or 2 months, if she went out and told the neighbor ladies, gee, you know, at 80 years old, I'm pregnant, and they looked at her, they'd think she was nuts. By 5 months, she's got a baby bump, and it's reasonable. So
Okay. All
she
right.
stays quiet, they all stay quiet.
Okay. So Jerry is offering another theory on why Elizabeth would go into hiding for 5 months. We're going to hold on to that until a little bit later, because I want to,
Mark, you
yes.
said that the times we can't be sure of, so 5 months then could not be what we're thinking 5 months is.
Okay, yeah. So one question is, did 5 months then mean what we think 5 months means now? And I think sort of it did.
It does?
Yeah. We're talking about a time when, at least in the written Greek language, we've got a sense of the days, weeks, months,
That are
time,
like
years,
us.
like we have now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they were watching the moon and the stars.
Oh, sure. I mean, that this was after that early Greek
Okay.
civilization started accounting for time. Yeah, but that's a great question. I read an interesting article this week. There's a journal called Noema. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. That means the mind or thinking. And it's put out by the Berger Institute, which is located in LA. It's a marvelous think tank. And they publish a journal once a year. So I got it last week and I was so excited to read it on the plane. Until I started watching movies, then I wasn't so excited. But they had a great article about clocks and time, and how the invention of calendars and clocks and so forth have drawn us away from our natural sense of time and rhythm, and made us force ourselves to fit a natural sense of time and rhythm. And one of the startling examples in the story was when a woman's giving birth, and they time the contractions, and then after a while they say, well, we waited too long, you need some Pitocin, or we're going to have to take the baby because you can't be in labor. And they bring in this sense of what the proper amount of time is. And that may or may not be right for this person. So there's kind of an interesting dialogue between time and nature, because time is not necessarily part of nature, but rhythm is. And so we are trying to capture rhythm with time. It's kind of an interesting thing. And I think your question is a good one, is that when did we start marking time that way? And why 5 months? Why in the 6th month? Why after 3 more months? I think the way Luke uses time, we've got a pretty good idea that their marking of months anyway is very similar to ours. Kind of interesting evolution of human thinking. Any other questions? Jen, are there any questions on the Zoom?
Not yet.
All right. So let's,
Now you can see, are you all right? Yeah, I felt I was sitting
Oh,
in front of
no.
you.
okay. So speaking of time, okay, I want to press into something I mentioned on the video. I hope I was clear about it. And that is when you read something, it seems to just happen like that. But then when you step back and look at how the story is telling itself, it must have taken a lot longer. So, for example, the dialogue between Gabriel and Zechariah, I'm guessing is 45 seconds long, if it's anything. And yet the people are out there wondering why he's lingering. That's one definition of the term that's used to talk about his delay, why he's lingering, and they're getting concerned. That generally doesn't kick in after 45 seconds,
Yeah.
right? So I like that it tells us that when we read these stories, we probably should savor them more than just read them. When we read them, we just kind of buzz right through them. I remember when I was in school, there was a big controversy over reading practices. And, they would put us on a timer. They'd give you a little bit more to kind of speed up our reading. And which is fine if you're trying to read fast. But if you're trying to appreciate something, I think it's detrimental to our reading. So when you see something like, meanwhile, the people were waiting, and that there was just a short little dialogue. Stop and just imagine that little synopsis of the dialogue simply shows you what's at play, but not perhaps what was said. And I'm not messing with biblical theory or anything like that. I'm just suggesting that if this was a long delay, then Luke self-consciously is giving us just a synopsis, not the full, Monroe of what happened in there, and inviting us to allow it to be a long dialogue. If you're going to tell an 80-ish-year-old man that his 80-ish-year-old wife is going to have a child, you don't just say, "Oh, by the way, your wife's going to have a child." I meant to tell you that, and just say it in passing, right? There's a lot of explaining. There's a lot of breaking it in. Likewise, I'm an angel. You don't just walk up and say that to somebody. You just scared the snot out of them by appearing out of nowhere. So by the dialogue like that, just I think Luke's inviting us to go back to that dialogue and say, "Hey, this took a while. Live with it for a moment. Let it be a lingering dialogue." The same thing would be like when his time of service was ended, he went home. Like, what was that? 4 weeks, 3 weeks, a month? We don't know, right? It's a simple little sentence that's over like that, but could have been drawn out. So imagine now, you got Zechariah, who's mute. He is mute. He's going to be mute for a while here. But he just goes back to work. Not taking sick leave, not taking a leave of absence. He's staying with the work, even though he's had this kind of life-shaking vision. I just really like how we're going to read something out of Genesis in a moment. That, boy, you want to talk about something that's a long process being handled in a very instantaneous sentence. You're going to see it in that story. I'll point it out when we get to that. So let's linger on this for a minute. When it says, for example, that he could not speak to them and they realized he had seen a vision in the sanctuary. That's not the first thing you jump to if somebody comes out and doesn't talk, right? You think they're choking, or you think they lost their voice. You think they're messing with you. Yeah, all kinds of things that run through your mind, right? So you don't immediately go, "Oh, well, you must have had a vision. You can't speak," right? We don't do that. And they didn't do that. So what does that realization look like? If you linger with the story, you've got Zechariah gesturing, you got the people realizing, put them together, you know, do this, practice this the next time you're sitting at a meal with somebody and saying, okay, I'll be Zechariah and I want to tell you something and pantomime it. And you guess what I'm saying, right? Right? You're doing all these gestures of an angel told me my wife would be pregnant. So just to me, that makes the story a lot more in kind with our story, because things don't happen like that in our lives. That's the problem I have with a lot of the healing stories, right? Is somebody's lame for 50 years and suddenly they're walking and jumping. And it's just like, are you kidding me? Guy hasn't stood up in 50 years. And not that it can't happen, but that when it happens, you know, there are human limitations that are being dealt with here and renewed. And just when we linger with the story, I think it makes them more real. Okay, I've probably beaten that horse to death. Any questions about that? Yes, ma'am.
I would think the interlude with the angel in the temple was probably longer than 45.
Yes, so there's a guess that the interlude between Gabriel and Zechariah was longer than 45 seconds.
Because I don't think that was a lingering time. I don't think that was a speed up time. I think that was probably.
That's my point, is that when you read it, it takes 45 seconds to read it, more or less. But when you think about it, yeah, I mean, we could be talking an hour or two, right? Of a real heart to heart. And Zechariah's question, but how do I know this to be so? I mean, that could come at the end of a long conversation, which is the point at which you might say, stop asking this question. I just told you, you know. So we look at it, we think, gosh, that seems a reasonable question. That's what I think. And then we think, wow, Gabriel certainly has a short fuse to kind of get all upset and strike somebody mute just for asking a reasonable question. But when you linger in it, you think, okay, it could be that Zechariah is just being a stinker here, or could not. We don't know. I mean, it's thin ice, right? We know it's more than a brief conversation, but we don't know with any certainty how exactly it happened.
Yeah, I find it interesting that we spend all this time about, you know, the pregnancy, the this, the that, when to me, the amazing thing is an angel showing up or an apparition or whatever it is and intervening in our lives. I mean, older people get pregnant these days, very young people get pregnant, but I don't know anyone that has had an angel come in and intervene in their life. I don't know if that's happened at St. Mark. Les knows somebody. But really, isn't that the thing that we should be pondering? God coming in and interfering in our life in what is a good way, but that just doesn't happen.
Yeah. Look, I'm with you on this. It's almost like the angel appears, scares the stinker out of people, and says, "Fear not," and then they're okay, and they start talking. And it's not like, wait, angel? Did you say angel? You're an angel. What do you? Can you fly? You know, why do you look like a bird? They take in stride something in the story that for us would just be earth shattering. It would change our view of how the world works. And that's, I don't know exactly what to do with that, except to appreciate it, that this is an uncommon thing that's being treated commonly. And I don't know how they get away with that. It's not like Zechariah grew up in a family full of people who saw angels all the time. We don't get that impression. Seems to be an odd thing, but they don't deal with the oddity of it.
Has it happened in the Old Testament before? Where angels?
Oh, yeah. We'll read that in just a moment.
Okay.
He's asking if there are Old Testament precedent. which is an important thing because this is storytelling. This is storytelling. And what Luke is doing by telling the story this way, it's drawing your mind back to another story that was told this way. And you're going to see some real parallels in just a moment.
There's an angel question in the chat.
Okay, there's an angel question in the chat. Yes, ma'am.
Do all angels have wings?
Absolutely not.
Well,
I do.
I know. I'm not answering that question
I don't.
because I can't answer that
I
question.
don't.
It depends on how you define angel. If an angel is somebody who does something lovely in your life, then it could be a four-legged creature that makes you come alive.
Amen.
This is not a four-legged creature. It might be a six-legged creature. We don't know what angels look like. There's a reference to in Daniel that the angel Gabriel came in swift flight, which is why we associate flying with angels. There are references to other heavenly creatures called seraphim, which might be like angels. They've got 6 wings. With 2, they cover their faces. With 2, they cover their feet. With 2, they fly. Is that an angel? Have you ever seen a 6-winged angel in the Christmas play? I don't think so. That sounds more like a harpy or a giant dragonfly or something, right? So it's important, I think, to separate the stories about the angels and the mythology about the angel that have developed since. Artists,
Oh, yeah.
they've done it all to convince us angels look like big birds and Jesus was very white, right? And you gotta, every artist, artistic vision grows out of their own context. So they don't know any more than we do what an angel looks like. But they're giving us a vision, their vision of how it might look. So I think Beryl's been trying to raise her hand for a while. Yes, ma'am.
I'm short on belief in this direction, but in my church in Smyrna Park, a young mother watched from the house as her young son rode his bike out into the street suddenly, right in front of like a UPS truck, young truck, and was hit and killed. And she's running out screaming, and she swears that she saw an apparition appear and bend down and pick up an image of his body, and that is the only thing that was saving her sanity in the days that followed. And it was a story that she stuck to in an amazing kind of way. And it's the only story of apparitions that I have.
Okay. Beryl sharing a story from that other church she attends when she's not where she's supposed to be. But it's about a mother whose child ran out in front of a UPS truck, was hit and killed. And as she ran after it, she saw an apparition of an angel picking up the child, which has comforted her.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So visions, dreams, those things, life after life moments that people have when they're dead and they're declared dead and they come back and they tell you they had a vision or something.
Near-death experiences.
Yeah, near-death experiences or post-death experiences. They almost always tend to reflect the mythology with which we grew up. So near-death experiences in China tend to be very different from near-death experiences in the US. Not necessarily a light, not necessarily an angel, but it's and I say that not to question or to demean anything, but I say we have these things out of who we are. And another way of saying that God works with us out of who we are. So who do we have in Zechariah? You've got a priest from the family of Abijah, who well suited for a very Old Testament sort of experience, because that's his life, right? And he's having one. He's had one. So let's move our attention a little bit from Zechariah to Elizabeth. Okay. And I went to the question that many of you are already anxious to answer. And I'm glad, because I don't know exactly what to do with it. But we got this phrase that Elizabeth went into seclusion for 5 months. Seclusion. That's an interesting translation. Could be translated she was hidden. She hid herself. It's a reflexive verb. So she hid herself for 5 months. And I think I mentioned to you that I can't remember his name now. One New Testament scholar who said that, I mean, he looked at that phrase and how it was used in other contexts, particularly with regard to pregnant women, but not just that. And that it often meant they veiled themselves. So this doesn't have to be going up to a cabin in the woods, right? The first thing you think of is she's an unwed teenager that gets pregnant, so they send her off to the family that lives in the mountains of Tennessee for a year. And then after she gives the baby up for adoption, she can come back. That used to happen. That used to be a form of seclusion and hiding. This is not what's going on here, apparently. She could simply be veiling herself. But whether she's veiling herself or staying inside, hiding out from people, the question is why?
She's
there's-
old.
Well, there's no obvious answer, so hang on. Your answers are great, but you just can't say it in the tone that this is the only answer. You have to say it as perhaps she's old. There's no precedent in scripture or in that culture that a pregnant woman needs to be in seclusion. Okay, so that's not what's happening here. It's not a custom. So let me give you a few ideas before we start entertaining yours. Okay. So I like to call, I like how, I think it's Bruce Longnecker who called this a narrative gap. What we're given is a fact that strikes us as curious, maybe raises questions, but doesn't bother answering them. And so he doesn't say why, Luke doesn't say why Elizabeth went into seclusion, just that she went into seclusion. And what that she's hiding herself. So we're left to wonder. And there are responsible ways of doing that, right? We can just use our own experience and say, well, I would. Are you kidding me? You should have seen me when I was pregnant. You know, we could say something like that. We could think about our own culture. We could think about an analogous situation. Probably a more secure footing for a biblical gap is to look at biblical stories that might be somewhat similar. But to be honest with you, that doesn't help a lot here. The most obvious biblical allegory at work, very obviously, is Sarah, and she didn't hide herself. So we don't know where this new wrinkle came from. Here are some suggestions. John Nolan, in his, I think the word commentary, says that she's seeking privacy in response to the intimate nature of God's dealing with her. It's a modesty argument. One that if she is, she's much more modest than anybody else in all the stories, because nobody else seems to do that, right? So I think John Nolan is modest. C.F. Evans says, and this is related, I think, to what you were saying, Jared, that Elizabeth is secluding herself, so visually hiding, not being seen, which corresponds with Zechariah, audibly muted, not being heard. So she's doing that kind of alongside of him being muted. That's an interesting thought. We do want to say that within the story, he's not choosing to be silent. and she is choosing to hide. So I don't know if that is as strong as it could be. Richard Benson says that this is all meant ironically, that she wanted a child. They prayed for many years, but she's past that now. Good heavens. It's ridiculous for her to have a child now. So he says that her phrase is ironic. Something like, so this is how the Lord rescues the faithful, with a sarcastic tone. Like, oh yeah, thanks God. Where were you 40 years ago when this would have been okay, right? So he thinks that there's a bit of shame and embarrassment that at this age, this is happening to me. Are you kidding? And yet the way her phrase is translated, it sounds like she's happy, right? This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favorably on me. That's a real word there. And took away the disgrace I have endured. If she's saying that sarcastically, then okay. But you can't capture sarcasm in written text. So that's always thin ice. But that's the direction Richard Benson goes with it. Joel Green says it's either an emphasis on modesty, or this is where I think you were going, Loretta. She's going to avoid telling everybody and showing herself in front of people until she's sure. Because if she's postmenopausal, then you don't have that first sign, right? That you've missed your period. And that's usually the first sign that causes someone to go by an early pregnancy test. She doesn't have that to lean on. So she's waiting for that baby bump. She's heard what the angel said to Zechariah, or she's seen what the angel said to Zechariah as he's communicated it through his muteness. And now she's waiting for evidence before she goes public herself. And it could be that in Luke's mind, 5 months is about the amount of time where you can say, oh, this is really baby and not explainable by other things, not an obstruction or anything like that. So Joel Green says that he kind of agrees that maybe she's doing that until she's sure. Denise Powell is the one that kind of directed me to a lot of these commentaries. She argues that Elizabeth going into hiding is proof that she believes what the angel said, unlike Zechariah. And she's got a lovely article that goes through all the possibilities. Just can't see where she makes the argument that this is a sign of belief. I want to agree with her, but I can't, because I can't see how she gets there in her argument. Others have gone a different route and said that the reason she goes into hiding for 5 months is because she's waiting, because her pregnancy is parallel to, but subordinate to, Mary's pregnancy. So, yes, she gets pregnant. Now she's off stage. The story immediately goes to Mary. We'll see that next week. And so Elizabeth is off stage while Mary is center stage. And then it's only when Mary is conceived that she and Elizabeth get back. Elizabeth comes back into the picture. So it would seem to be the same kind of subordination of Elizabeth's pregnancy to Mary's story that we see John always being validated but subordinated next to Jesus' story. That's kind of an interesting possibility. Raymond Brown sees it as this story is what really intensifies the miracle of Mary's story. Like, boy, you can think a postmenopausal woman can get married, can get pregnant. Check this out. A virgin is getting pregnant. Wow, God can do some great things and even greater things. Something like that is kind of breathing the skids in some way. So, all of which is to say that when you have a narrative gap like this, even if you try to discipline yourself to guessing what it means within the parameters of scripture, it's wide open. And probably the best thing to do is just kind of listen to all the perspectives. We're all going to have an opinion as to which one is better. So that is the point at which I want to turn back to you. And now, which of these, or which of your opinion, do you find more convincing?
There's some commentary in the chat.
Okay.
Some suggestions and ideas. Hyperemesis gravidarum can last about 5 months. So when pregnant women get very sick, a lot of throwing up, vomiting. So it could have been a condition like that where she withdrew. Another suggestion.
Especially if John the Baptist is going to be hairy. Hairy babies come sick.
No, they cause heartburn. That's what they're saying. That's another guess is she might have had many early miscarriages in previous pregnancies, and so it's sort of a bed rest.
Yeah, so yeah, or similar to make sure this one.
Yeah, and then
Go ahead.
there was another one that kind of echoed the making sure, said that they didn't want to be, or she didn't want anyone to think she was crazy, because you have, he's struck dumb, he can't talk, and she's
Right.
saying she's pregnant, and so was it a sort of face saving until, look, everyone, I'm pregnant.
Everybody in the room hear that okay? Yeah, those of you on the Zoom, you can read it in the chat. Yes, Shirley.
First of all, I always remind myself that someone's telling the story.
A man, by the way.
Yes,
Go ahead.
that makes a difference to me, but I didn't feel it strange that she stays away from everybody, because when I read in Elizabethan times and times before that, women who were pregnant, they shrouded themselves and stayed out of public. That was a woman's place, to be home, cook, have the babies, and they didn't go out and walk around and strut with their big. So I didn't find that was so different, and then a man's telling this story anyway.
Okay, so let me communicate that to these folks. You ought to hear what Shirley's saying over here. First of all, she's contextualizing that there's a man telling the story, which is absolutely important. She's remembering that there have been periods of time when pregnant women were not seen in public.
That's right.
As a modesty thing, which is one of the arguments we heard from Joel Green,
Yes.
that maybe it has a lot to do with modesty. We're not aware that that was necessarily a custom at the time, but we don't know all the customs at the time. So that's a possibility.
Well, I'm beholden at this point to Ken Bailey because of the way he described Palestinian life. And struck me that when Elizabeth left home, she was not pregnant. She comes back and she's pregnant, and everybody looks and says, "What happened to you?" And
Okay.
so the town is gathering, trying to figure out where this baby bump came from. And I think she's having to grow into it.
Okay,
They're gossiping.
so
They're gossiping. The town is gossiping about
okay,
how did this happen?
yeah. So Les is raising the question. You're assuming that when Zechariah went into Jerusalem to do his thing, that Elizabeth went with him. And I'm not sure that we know that, but
It's true.
if she went with him, she comes back, someone who never could get pregnant, and in postmenopausal age is suddenly pregnant, and is just avoiding all the gossiping, the guesswork. Because, as we can see, there's a lot of room for guesswork here, what's going on.
Amen.
And you think her story is going to be hard for people to believe. What about Mary's? Right? Yeah, sure. It was God.
That's right.
So maybe again, this kind of falls under the same idea that Shirley and Joel Green are suggesting, that there's some kind of a modesty or an avoidance of being the town topic of how did this happen? You just get tired of that stuff, perhaps, and maybe she's just avoiding it. I don't know. That's a good guess.
And I like the idea of that it's her faithfulness to God, and that.
Okay, tell me how that works for you, Deborah. Yep. Okay, I'm just going to try to interpret.
Because my thought was that we only know she was childless. We don't know that she didn't have any miscarriages, and that was what I thought. And that in the time she's taking the time to make sure that that the pregnancy is viable. And then when it finally is, then she can feel relaxed. But when you were talking about that position about her being faithful, that struck me as very possible.
Okay, so for Deborah, it sounds like a little mix between two of the things we've heard. One is making sure, but also that she's faithfully making sure.
Right.
Because she wants to proclaim, this is what the Lord has done for me. And so maybe that phrase comes at the end of 5 months when she's able to make sure. And that's what she's been focused on. And now she's proclaiming. That's great.
I have a question. When I
Yes.
was reading this, when it talks about Zacharias, when the men went into the temple for their duty, as it's called, did they spend the nights there and just stay there, say for a month at a time? I had the feeling the way it read here that it said after his duty was done, he went home, and then sometime later she became pregnant.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if the men, when they do that, they sleep there. So he wasn't home with her during that time. I don't know.
Right.
But I thought of that.
So the question is, what if Zechariah is on duty? Is he staying in the temple?
Yeah, do they
Yeah.
sleep overnight in the
And I suspect not, because the crowd's outside praying and they're wondering why he hasn't come out.
All right.
But certainly he would stay in Jerusalem,
Where the temple
right?
was.
It's too far generally if you don't live in town for a day trip. And we don't know exactly what it looked like. There are some documents from the era called the Second Temple era that talked about lighting the incense and so forth. It's an elaborate process. It's not, you go in there and light the candle and leave. So it's an elaborate process, and it involves a lot of prayer, probably some singing and so forth. But then it's done. And then you kind of retire, and then you come back and do another thing. But I like, Shirley, I love that you're picking up on the phrase that when he gets back, in those days, Elizabeth conceived. It's almost like when he gets home, then she conceives. This will tell you that it's not God. It's Zechariah. Zechariah goes home. In those days, she conceived. This is not Mary's story. This is Elizabeth's story. It's not an immaculate conception. It's a late conception. But Zechariah seems quite involved. And that's good for both of them. Let me move to one more thing, unless there's somebody who has another. Janice, did I see you raise your hand a moment?
I was going to say, Elizabeth is pondering these things in her heart. I'm thinking about Mary because I know there's a line coming.
Yeah,
Am I right? Yeah.
you are, right. Mary's going to end up being the first theologian in Luke's gospel because she will ponder these things in her heart. Yeah. And, she and Elizabeth seem to be cut from the same cloth. So that 5 months might have been a real intense time. Let me read a couple of things with you, which I think Elizabeth's story is supposed to be echoing. So remember, Elizabeth says, this is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people. I'm going to assume for a moment that she's not speaking ironically, that she means it, but we can entertain the ironic stuff later. Let me read Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, and he sat at the entrance of his tent, as he sat in the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. I'm just going to warn you that it's the Lord, and then later it's going to be angels, and then it's going to be two men. And it just morphs in the storytelling, which I think happens because there's more than one group telling the story, and they're all writing on top of each other. Anyway, Abraham looked up and he saw three men. Okay, so the Lord appeared, but Abraham looked up and he saw three men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran for the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, my Lord, which is singular, these are three men, my Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after that, you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. And Abraham, you want to talk about something that reads quickly but takes forever? Check this out. Abraham hastened to the tent to Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes. In 5 minutes, Sarah, you can do it. Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. So you're going to kill it, skin it, drain it, fillet it, cook it, all in a matter of a few minutes. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. They're very patient. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. Okay. And they said to him, where's your wife, Sarah? And he said, there in the tent. Then one of them said, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Again, men writing the story don't quite know how to say things, so they talk around it. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I've grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it and said, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, oh, yes, you did laugh. I love how the Lord called her out. Don't lie to me, woman. All right. So you've got this great story, right? And we're remembering last week, we looked in chapter 17 and saw that when the Lord came to Abraham and said, you're going to have a child, he said, oh, it'll be Hagar, Hagar's son Ishmael. And God said, no, Sarah's going to have a child. What did Abraham do? He laughed.
Yeah.
So you got Abraham and Sarah both laughing. They're remembered in history as having believed, and it was accounted unto them as righteousness. But they laughed. They laughed. And obviously, I'm going to say, obviously, it's not a laughter of joy. Hey, God's going to do this great thing for us. Rejoice with me. It's like, you got to be kidding me, right? Because of what Sarah said. So this is the laughter of derision in some way. It's not a faithful laughter.
Disbelief.
Yes, it is disbelief and not trust or belief. So in some way, Sarah, well, let me, immediately after this, those 3 men or the Lord, whatever it is, that were there visiting the temple, the tent, they leave and they go take care of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's the story that follows immediately. And then when it's over, we're going to have a baby. Chapter 21, the Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time which God had spoken to her. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son whom Sarah had borne him. And you remember the name Isaac means laughter. So they're embracing the ridiculousness of it and making it a cause for celebration. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, remember what Elizabeth said. God has done this and taken away my disgrace. Sarah says, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have ever said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in old age. That, I think, is what Elizabeth is echoing in this story. Remember, the story of John the Baptizer's birth, I think, is a story that was cultivated among John's followers. And so these old Hebrew stories mean a ton to them. And they're hearing the echo. Zechariah and Elizabeth are Abraham and Sarah. John the Baptizer is Isaac. This is funny. This is ridiculous. It is a thing about which you snicker in your sleeve and then you rejoice because it actually happened. So your first impression and your lasting impression are going to be different. Your first impression is going to be they're crazy. Your lasting impression is going to be this is wild, in a good way. And I think that's I still don't quite understand the hiding, but I think the proclamation that Elizabeth makes is very much in keeping with the Sarah analogy that's been going on all along. The final thing I want to let me ask, do you have any questions? Jen, are there any questions? Any comments? Okay, so the final thing I want to think about is the role of children in these stories. It's really obvious in the Old Testament stories that when you're in an agrarian context, you have a couple of jobs. One is to fill the earth, be fruitful and multiply, and the other is to till the earth. Because
Genesis
that's
1 and 2.
till the earth. What's that?
Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah. So you're fruitful and multiply, and you're working to provide. And those are the two ongoing things. You remember in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden, the punishments, more or less, I don't know if they're punishments, but the realities for the two of them is that she will give birth in pain, and he will till the earth by the sweat of his brow. So it's he's going to have to work hard to do this. It's not going to be the abundance that they could just pick and eat in the Garden of Eden, and childbirth is going to be difficult. It was often deadly. This is not, when someone has a child and they rejoice, it's a big deal because too often the mother or the child or both couldn't survive that ordeal. Midwives were hugely important. And so there's a kind of an honor given to having children. People had lots of children, just like 2 generations ago, Midwest farmers had lots of children. Those were your farm hands in some respects. Inheritance laws are a huge deal in the Old Testament because farmland is a set asset, and multiple children, you can't keep chopping it up. Eventually, it's no longer a sustainable farm. This is the issue that my wife's parents and aunts and uncles had to deal with. They have a century farm in Iowa, and they can't all farm it. So the father made a decision that this son gets the farm. And that was hard. It remains hard after many, many years. But eventually it comes down to something like that. So having children is important. Bearing a name is important. I'm not convinced in the Old Testament that there's yet a theology of the afterlife. So your children are in some ways the way that you live on and your legacy survives. That's huge. Get to the New Testament, things have changed considerably. You don't necessarily hear about someone having 12 sons plus a bunch of daughters, right? Because so many people have been dispossessed of their land. This was part of the Roman Empire's effect, and as well as just plain greed over the years. And people have lost their land and moved to the city. A lot of Jesus' parables are about a landowner and tenant farmers, a landowner and slave. These are people who once had their own land but don't anymore. Or you've got day laborers being hired in the city. People go to the city hopes of getting some kind of a job. So it's kind of like the migration patterns of the industrial age, when so many people went from small sustainable family farms into the city. That's part of the reality of living under the Roman Empire. And so you've got some interesting kind of parallels, that children meant one thing in the Old Testament, and children kind of mean a different thing in the New Testament. There aren't as many. It's not as economically driven. I mean, the other obvious change is people only were married to one person in the New Testament. And we think, oh, that's because they were good Jews. And that's not the right answer. In the Old Testament, people had many spouses. They were considered good Jews. The person that really started the family values movement was probably Julius Caesar, who made it illegal for people to have more than one spouse, for men to have more than one spouse. He and all of his aristocratic friends ignored that considerably, but he made it law. And by the time you get to the New Testament and you don't really have polygamy anymore, it's not a religious thing. It's a cultural thing and probably an imperial thing. So when we read these stories of children being born, let's appreciate the layers here. There's us and how we feel about children. I got to tell you right now, I'm all for them. I just had a great time with my 1-year-old granddaughter. So there's our feeling about children. There's the New Testament times and what children meant to families at that time. Genealogy was still the way you identify who somebody is. You don't say they were a carpenter right off the bat. You say, oh, they're the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. And then in the Old Testament, children had yet another meaning, but it's evolving. And just kind of bear that in mind when you have a New Testament story being kind of a rechristened Old Testament story, echoed in the New Testament. You're getting a story that is now fitting into a new context. And that's probably, if you watch the way that the biblical writers do that, you're probably getting a very good lesson on how we take these ancient stories and fit them into our context. Mm-hmm. There's analogy, there's disanalogy. There are things similar and there are things not similar. And it's all faithful. That's the cool part. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So in some respects, just as the gospel writers wanted a name that would lend authority to what they were writing, in some ways, to have a story that echoed what a story they already knew, lent authority and credence to what they were trying to say in their time and in their story. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I want to repeat this. I'm convinced that it's a little thicker here than just, so the gospel writers sometimes will draw on an older story to lend authority and meaning to their story, which is what we do when we have narrative cultures. That's part of what it means to be part of a culture, is we have this repository of shared stories. Nowadays, they're mostly television and Netflix, but you have your cultural stories that lend meaning to things. And
Kind of lessons.
kind of lessons, moral lessons and so forth. Aesop's Fables probably provided that.
I was thinking that.
Homeric ethics provided that at one point. I think Aristotle's philosophy depends on Homer's stories. And if you're not familiar with
Yeah.
those stories, you probably don't see why he takes certain things for granted. Alistair McIntyre has been the ethicist that's really revived this sort of thinking narratively, that we're part of a story, and those stories give meaning to each new reality. But again, I think it's a little thicker here because I don't think Luke's immediate audience would be as familiar with Abraham and Sarah's story as John the Baptizer's followers. And I think that's where Luke got this story. So they told John the Baptist's story drenched in Old Testament analogy. Because for them, that's where the meaning was. As you read on, you're going to find in Luke, there's going to be some Old Testament analogy, but it's not nearly as strong as it is in Matthew, because he's not talking to Jews. He's probably talking to Greek-speaking, Greek-reading, Gentile Christians. And there'll be other stories from which they'll draw. Just saying, okay? When we get to Jesus' birth story, there are some precedents for that too, and they're not in the Old Testament. So that's something Luke will be drawing on as well. Okay, we're past time, so we're going to say goodbye to our Zoom friends. Thank you all very much for being here. And Sue Ann, you can stop the recording at this point.
It's a good number, isn't it?
Thank you all for being here as well.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Apologies.
Exciting time for you.
We have a new copier coming to the church today, and Sue Ann is probably busy with that. She'll stop the recording eventually.
Isn't it sort of a challenge when you wake up in the morning? You'll get to the next thing to do. What comes after that?
Keep going until you're done, and then you do the next thing.
Sometimes it's not easy.
No, but.
I mean, I'm laying there thinking, oh my gosh, you know, after I get through that, now what am I gonna do? Where am I going?
Yeah, that's that. And then the kids, and they want,
Kids.
and their stuff.
Yeah, that guy who played Zachariah. What are you gonna do? Such an interesting time.
Lots going on. So.
I can almost remember back when we went get a job or do something. That's gonna define the say where. So I'm happy for you and that past fail sort of interesting.
Yeah, I guess that's.
Oh, well, it is. Because the last thing our churches should be doing is looking for somebody to sort of 95 or something. That's hard.
Although the graders were picking on my previous ones, I had some crazy graders.
Really?
It's like one comment, like, it's kind of rambling, but it's like an impressive. We have 9 hours to write that up, so it's gonna be, it's not gonna be my most beautiful hour. It's not, I'm not gonna publish this, like, let's be honest. It's a nice.
Have a good time. Well, I will.